Transforming complex XML data structures. Writing expressions for XML output. When mapping array elements, JSON or Java, to XML, wrap the map operation in curly braces in parentheses. The curly braces are effectively defining the object, while the parentheses are transforming each element in the array as a key value pair. Looking to the left of our two-object input once again, you can see in the top line, similar to what we had already where we just put in users. That's going to provide us a cannot coerce an array to an object exception. Now, if we change that up such that the user's key has a value where we're wrapping the curly braces in parentheses of that general XML structure, it's going to output with the user tags on the top and bottom, and then those various elements inside for first name, last name in this case. Again, the curly braces defining the start and end of the object, in the parentheses transforming each element in the array as a key value pair. Looking at this example continued on the left here with our two objects, if we've wrapped this up in the top row, you can once again see the first name, last name. In the bottom, inside of payload map, we can still have the user in place as you've seen here, but in this case, we're defining the user explicitly such that in the XML on the right, you can see that each user is wrapped in a user tag, which in XML is probably more well formed that way, in the sense that each user object is wrapped rather than sticking all the first names and last names together. Now, if we want to write expressions for XML input where we want to use multiple elements inside, we can use the asterisk, not just for multiple elements, but specifically for repeated elements. So if we look at our input on the left, where we've got users with two users coming in, well, what if we want to access those users? Well, first we could, of course, do payload for the JSON output that would generate this general structure. If we call payload.users, it would no longer bother wrapping it in users. It would go right down to the user level and wrap each user object, as you can see on the right. Now the third row down, of course, we could specify users.user, which would give us that specific user object, but it's just one user object in that third row. What if we want them all? Well, we could say payload.users.*user, and you can see inside of here, where we've got Mule and Jeanette, we've effectively constructed these two objects out of every user element that it could find. In the very last option or example, you can see payload.users.allUsers. We can even pass that through the map operator we learned about, in which case we can then construct inside of there a first name based on the value of the first name attribute, name of the value of the last name element, constructing what you see in the JSON output on your right. Now, you want to also beware of tools that prettify responses. In some tools like Postman, make sure you look at the raw response and not the pretty response. This ensures that you can actually see the structure that's coming out in the form that Mule is working. Nothing wrong with looking at the parsed results, but depending on how the structure is being created, it could skew what's actually being put out of Mule versus what Postman believes the structure should look like once it's parsed in the pretty format. So let's start with walkthrough 10.4, transform to and from XML with repeated elements. In this walkthrough, we'll transform a JSON array of objects to XML, and then in reverse, we'll transform XML with repeated elements to a Java structure. Let's get started. Back in Anypoint Studio with our transform message selected inside of post multiple flights flow, let's change the expression to map each item in the input array to an XML element. So we've got flights in place, but as we learned in the slides, we need to wrap this in the curly braces and parentheses. And at the very end, we'll once again do the parenthesis and the curly brace. And then do some level of indentation just to make it a little bit easier to read here. All right, so now we can see a data structure on the right side here where we are once again specifying flight as its own element with an index, and then each flight, including the index appended to the end here, being put inside of all this data. So you can see the structure coming down similar to what we had with the JSON. Now let's go ahead and remove the flight property such that we just have flight with a single $, and the flight double $sign goes away altogether. Now this is a bit of a cleaner structure. We've got flights, and then each flight is wrapped in flight elements, and all of the data is represented as XML inside of here. Now, in the input section, let's click the X on the payload tab. And we'll click Close Tab and Keep File. In the input section, we'll right-click on Payload, and we will clear metadata. In the preview section, we'll click the link to create the required sample data once again. And in the sample data types, let's change the metadata this time to XML, and then we'll click the Add button here for the actions, or the ellipse button for the actions, and we'll click the Add button for Select Metadata. Now, inside of here, we're going to call this Flights XML, since this is going to be our first inbound XML that we're transforming and going over repeat elements. We'll create the type. The type, of course, will be XML. And then if we choose example here and browse out, we can now look down and grab our flights-example.xml file from source test resources, and let's hit select. Then we'll hit OK. With OK in place, we can once again see the XML on the left side here in the preview pane. And on the right side, we can basically see a pretty similar structure. Granted, it's definitely parsed up and transformed a bit, but a pretty similar structure to what we had before, plus some extra tags like return. Now, if we look at the sample data inside of the input section, and I'll just make this a bit bigger so it's a little bit easier to read here. Inside of here, we can see we have this return element, a bunch of information, and effectively each flight is wrapped inside of the return statement. Now, if we go back over to our preview section, which I'll once again move these over so it's a bit easier to see. Maybe go back to just this view. There we go. In the preview section, we can once again see how this is translated with flights flight, and then we have a return that effectively is going to wrap each of these. Now let's change the data weave expression to loop over the list all flights response element of the payload. This way we don't have to have that nasty return tag that's wrapping every single one of our flights. To do this, inside of flights payload map, instead of running payload through the map, let's specifically run payload dot, and in our list we'll do ns0 list all flights response and double click. Now with this in place, move this over a bit so it's easier to see. With this in place, we are now going through inside of list all flights response and not concerning ourselves with each of those returns in the output structure here on the right. Now, let's say that we just want the return element itself. So if we do dot return inside of here, no asterisk, just dot return, you'll see how it will grab each return inside, and it'll generate this structure where it effectively grabs, in this case, really just one of the returns, and inside of that return, it grabs each element and wraps it in flight, which is less than ideal to what we typically want, because we don't just want one return, we effectively want all of those repeat return elements to be passed through this map operator. So you guessed it, we'll put an asterisk inside of here, and that will effectively say that we want to run through the map operator every repeat return, which effectively gives us the data structure that we want, flights with each flight inside of it. Now, let's say we want to customize this structure a bit. So inside of flight, maybe we want to have destination and price as sub-elements. So inside of flight, we'll open up another object inside, and from inside of this object, we'll put in DEST for destination, and we'll use our $dot to call out to the destination. We'll put a comma in place, and we'll try the same thing for price. So we'll do $price. And now we've grabbed these specific elements, and you can see the structure is generated, where in flights, the flight tag is wrapping each of the destination prices for each of the flight objects inside of here. Before continuing, let's change our application XML output type to application Java, as it'll become prevalent in a little bit later. But just take a quick observation that when we switch to Java, you can see this general structure coming over from the return and how it is effectively generating using our all returns the different flights inside of here, in our case with PDX and 2830 inside of our sample data, specifically for one flight. Now, inside of the data weave expression, if we remove the curly brace parenthesis from the equation altogether, and now we'll change it to remove the flight property as well. And now we can see that we have a structure of flights with each of these objects for each return. So it is once again taking each instance of the repeat element return and running it through the map operator so that for each instance it generates a structure that contains destination and price, as you can see for all 4 of the objects it's created on the right.